Facebook, Twitter and Google have monopolized free speech online. They're a monopoly.
These things need to be regulated, and we are going to need some kind of digital Bill of Rights.
This is another great argument for rendering these sites into public utilities.
Wrong!
So with the banning of Alex Jones off of YouTube, Google, and Apple, there's been a lot of talk about what to do about this. You know, with Alex Jones' censoring, it seems the right is now fond of government power. We're all statists now, right? We want the government to come in and do for us what we want it to do. We have to, as one person said, abandon the free market to save it.
I've abandoned free market principles to save the free market system.
We can look at a lot of their arguments, including making them public utilities, monopolies, and the Internet Bill of Rights, and we can see they're not really good solutions, and I'm going to run through them one by one and offer some actual solutions to the problem. So let's start with the idea that they are public utilities. What is a public utility? A public utility is an organization that maintains the infrastructure for a public service. Public utilities are subject to forms of public control and regulation ranging from local community-based groups to statewide government monopolies. Interesting. The term utilities can also refer to a set of services provided by these organizations. Electricity, gas, water, sewage, telephone, transportation, broadband internet services are increasingly being included within the definition. So we can see here that public utilities deal with infrastructure. YouTube, Google, they have nothing to do with actual infrastructure. Like the definition goes on, broadband internet services are increasingly being included. That is the ISPs, not the companies that operate on the internet. So when you say we need to regulate them like the public utility, well, they aren't a public utility. This is an argument for net neutrality, regulating the ISPs, not the companies that are on the internet. And of course, net neutrality wouldn't have saved Jones from being kicked off YouTube. It would have simply meant that everyone had equal access to a Jonesless YouTube. Another interesting point, it comes out and says they're often statewide government monopolies. So you want YouTube to be a monopoly, you want Google to be a monopoly. Interesting, because that kind of runs contra to the other criticism that YouTube, Google, and these companies are monopolies. So this is on its face untrue, because we can see there are clearly many, many, many competitors in search engines like DuckDuckGo and Bing, going all the way back to Ask Jeeves. There have been multiple search engines available since the beginning of the internet. The same is true for video hosting sites. Not only is BitChute and DTube two very good alternatives, but there have been some less than great alternatives, including Dailymotion, other video streaming sites that are not exactly searchable. They're more for pirated stuff like your Putlockers or your Gorilla Vids. But all of these are competitors to YouTube. To claim these companies are monopolies or to ignore huge vast swaths of available platforms. And beyond that, we need to ask ourselves, where do monopolies come from?
Ask yourself, where do monopolies come from? In the United States, the most important and the strongest monopolies are unquestionably those that derive from governmental privilege. The monopoly of a TV license granted by the government at a zero price. That's a source of monopoly privilege. It also has been a source of wealth for some notable Americans.
TV licensing from the FCC granting monopolies. Keep that in mind for later. That will be important.
The grant of a tariff protection. Would the steel industry in the United States have any kind of monopoly or oligopoly position if it weren't able to get government to impose restrictions on imports of foreign items and so on? Trade union monopolies. They get their strength and their support from Davis-Bacon Act, Walsh-Healy Act, other governmental measures that interfere with competition by others. To every other case, you have temporary monopolies develop, and if the government doesn't come in to shore them up, they fall to pieces. The railroads became a monopoly only because they were able to get the Interstate Commerce Commission established. Trucking is a monopoly because the ICC keeps out competitors. And you can go down the line and find that one hypothetical monopoly case after another derives from governmental assistance and support.
So we can see that in almost all cases, monopolies are granted by the government, often in the name of making something a public utility. So the idea that you're going to have a monopoly, the idea that YouTube and Google are monopolies, and that shouldn't be, so we have to regulate them like public utilities, these two arguments run contra to each other. So you're going to have to pick one or the other. And neither are good choices, as they don't fit the definition of public utility, and they aren't monopolies. Using the government to break the monopoly is not something that's historically accurate, but we can talk about that later. I want to talk about the Internet Bill of Rights very quickly, because I think this is a foolish mistake to make. So, if we pass an Internet Bill of Rights, who writes it? Well, the government does. But who will enforce it? Would it be the United States passes the Internet Bill of Rights, so it's limited to the nation that passes it? Well, what if these companies decide they don't want to be subject to that and they move their headquarters? All of a sudden, Facebook, YouTube, Google, they're based in France. What are you going to do about that? Are they going to choose to follow our Internet Bill of Rights? Do you trust the government to enforce this? Maybe the solution, we have to pass a Internet Bill of Rights at a post-national level. Maybe the EU passes it, the UN. Do we trust either of them to do this? I seem to remember recently the EU trying to pass a link tax and a internet filter. So these are the people who are going to protect your rights on the internet? Or how about the UN's direction on hate speech, the claim that banning hate speech isn't a violation of human rights, in complete contrary to the First Amendment of the United States? So you want to pass an Internet Bill of Rights that is either unenforceable worldwide because it's limited to the nation that passes it, or that's enforced by post-national bureaucrats who have absolutely zero respect for internet freedom and free speech. This seems a bit self-defeating. And part of the problem is a Bill of Rights is meant to restrain the government, not to call it into action. So you don't actually need enforcement of a Bill of Rights. A Bill of Rights is meant to keep the government from doing something. So when a Bill of Rights calls on the government to do something, you see spotty enforcement. You've seen that with the 14th Amendment did that to the American Bill of Rights. And you've seen very spotty application of it on things like the Second Amendment. So what happens when the government just doesn't enforce something, or when court decisions slowly eat away at the Bill of Rights? The American Bill of Rights has been eroded time and time again by either bad court decisions or by laws that have never even been challenged. This is a unreliable way of bringing about internet freedom, and one that, again, puts the definition of your freedom in the hands of the government. So do we trust the government to do that, to protect our freedoms? Now, as much as I like the God Emperor memes, Donald Trump won't always be in office. We're talking about people like, maybe Senator Chris Murphy, or someone like him who may come to power. Based on his recent comments, you think he's going to be quick to protect anyone's freedom on the internet? Or maybe you're depending on people like Representative Ratskin and Rep. Douche to do so?
And we know it's now an ideological fixture on the right wing in America to deny the existence of these atrocities, like what took place in Newtown, Connecticut, what took place in Parkland, and then to allege that they're the product of some kind of conspiracy or hoax. And of course, the founding myth in this vein is Holocaust revisionism, which claims that the Holocaust never took place.
I want to know how you're dealing with all these conspiracy theorists on your platform.
Yeah, it's not like they've taken an adversarial stance to free speech. Maybe we can trust European politicians. Maybe the British might do it better.
You serious?
Yeah, all of that seems absurd on its face, and anyone who's been following the politics recently knows that the government is no friend of free speech. Even as the Republicans take that stance now, in the past, we've seen conservatives attack free speech that runs contra to their interests. So why do you think they'll be friendly forever? Why would you want to give them the power? But, of course, that's all speculative. We don't really know what they might do in the future. So instead, we can look at the history of some of this regulation. The one people seem most energized about is regulating them like the phone company. Well, let's look at the history of the Bell system, which was the phone company for about 150 years. The Bell system was a system of companies led by the Bell Telephone Company and later AT&T, which provided telephone services to much of the United States and Canada from 1877 to 1984, more than 100 years. At various times, a monopoly. On December 31st, 1983, the system was divided into independent companies by a U.S. Justice Department mandate. Oh, so it did work after, 100 years. So, I mean, if you want to wait 100 years for these antitrust suits to actually work, that might be a choice. On April 30th, 1907, Theodore Newton Vail returned as president of AT&T. Vail believed in the superiority of one national telephone system, and AT&T adopted the slogan, "One policy, one system, universal service." This is interesting because that universal service bit, I thought it was the government that forced them to give universal service. It seems more like it was a decision by the company to do so. This became the company's philosophy for the next 70 years. Under Vail, AT&T began acquiring many of the smaller telephone companies, including Western Union Telegraph. Anxious to avoid action from government antitrust suits, AT&T entered into an agreement known as the Kingsbury Commitment with the federal government. Oh, so they avoided these antitrust suits by teaming with the government. Now, what was that Kingsbury Commitment? Following a government antitrust suit in 1913, remember, it wasn't until 1984 that these suits actually worked. Following a government antitrust suit in 1913, AT&T agreed to the Kingsbury Commitment, in which AT&T would sell its $30 million in Western Union stock, allow competitors to interconnect with its system, and not acquire another independent company without permission from the U.S. Interstate Commerce Commission. So what you see here is an antitrust suit came against them, and they agreed, oh, we'll sell some stock, and we'll allow competitors to connect to our system. Essentially, we'll offer the system, competitors will go out and get us new customers and give us a cut of them, all with the blessing of the Interstate Commerce Commission. In 1949, the United States Department of Justice alleged in an antitrust lawsuit that AT&T and the Bell System operating companies were using their near monopoly in telecommunications to attempt to establish unfair advantages in related technologies. The outcome was a 1956 consent decree, another government-private agreement, limiting AT&T to 85% of the United States national telephone network and certain government contracts. So the sum total of something like 70 years of antitrust suits or attempted government regulation was that AT&T would allow competitors to connect to their system, giving them a cut of every new phone customer, as well as promising to limit their share to 85% of the market. You know, that leaves, if YouTube were given a similar deal, that would leave a whopping 15% of the market for companies like BitChute and DTube. Certainly, this sounds like a good plan. This is not handing YouTube, Google, Apple a government-sanctioned cartel over telecommunications or the internet or anything like that, right? This is freedom. You know, this reeks of freedom, right? Not the cartelization of the internet with the government's blessing. So antitrust suits didn't work in phones. They just cut government deals to monopolize or oligopolize the market anyway. But YouTube, Facebook, these companies aren't exactly like the phone company, in which the phone company allows for private messages to travel over their lines, but they aren't broadcast publicly. You know, YouTube hosts videos that everyone can watch. Facebook, you can view the messages online. All of this is much more like TV and radio. And all you have to do, well, you can remember Mr. Friedman's words. TV was cartelized by the FCC. They handed out FCC license. And as a result, there was 3 TV networks for the vast majority of TV's history. And these TV networks were notoriously censorious because the FCC is notoriously censorious. You can see this in maybe the most infamous example is Elvis Presley's performance on the Ed Sullivan Show, where they were able only to film him from the chest up for fear that he might shake his hips.
Here is Elvis. This is my biggest record, and it goes something like this.
Ah, yes, such expression, much freedom. But so, it didn't really work. This government control didn't really work in TV. It kind of just, again, cartelized everything for the sake of a few networks and a few rich corporate types. So maybe free radio was better? Well, I'm old enough to remember the gauntlet of fines leveled at Howard Stern when he was still on free radio. Here's a list of them. It's roughly, what is that? 9, 12, about 15 fines over a 14-year period, totaling more than $2 million. That sound like a bastion of free speech to you? Really? That seems like the direction the internet should go, where people are fined for saying the wrong thing and eventually completely driven off the platform because they can't afford to be there. And that's only part of the story. The censorious nature of the government agencies and the cartelizing are clearly a terrible future for the internet. But there was also the payola scandal. Payola in the music industry is the illegal practice of payment or other inducement by record companies for the broadcast of recordings on commercial radio. This was a result. Well, let me put it to you this way. Do you think this is more or less likely to happen when there are a few stations allowed to broadcast, and the only way to get your song heard in the sea of hundreds of songs is to maybe grease the wheels a little? Yeah, it's exactly the kind of cartelization that government regulation creates that encourages this kind of corruption. So what you get, so if history repeats itself with the phone company, the TV networks, and radio, what we see is a government-sponsored cartel of very censorious types controlling what you see and hear. Is that the future you want for the internet? Does that really sound like a solution to the problem? I would think twice about that. But I'm sure that wasn't real regulation, right? That wasn't what we actually wanted. It'll work this time, I promise. This is a foolish line of thought. So you might ask, what are the actual solutions? Well, with TV, radio, and the phone, what we saw was innovation brought in by satellite radio, by cable TV, by cell phones, by new technologies that were able to break these cartels and operate with a much lighter regulatory touch. AT&T's trust was broken up in 1984, but in some place in the country, technology was so stagnant that there were still party lines. Yeah, party lines where you had to share a phone line with your neighbors well into the 90s. It wasn't until cell phones that people actually had a personal line in their pocket. TV was 3 networks until cable came along, and now we have hundreds of choices. Most of it's crap, but at least there are choices. Radio, like Howard Stern, is a great example. He faced millions of dollars in fines on free radio. Satellite radio, you can listen to him uncensored in all his glory without any trouble. So it seems pretty obvious that the most simple solution is competition. You might say, well, how do you compete against these big firms? Well, I remind you what Mr. Friedman said about the government creating these monopolies. All it takes is a quick look, and you can see that corporations like Google, for instance, get over $600 million in money from the government. This is taxpayer money you never gave to Google, you gave to the government, and they pass it on along to Google. So I ask, why would you expand government control when you can peel back government and take your money back away from these companies and put it in your pocket to spend it where you want? Apple as well has benefited from a series of US government funded research. So again, why would you want the government to have more control when you can simply peel back the government's use of your money to subsidize these companies, undermining their bottom line and forcing them to compete on the same ground that companies like BitChute, DuckDuckGo, or these other companies that don't receive massive aid compete on? We could even the playing field, or we could just give a government-sponsored cartel to these companies. I think the choice is obvious, but what do I know? Now, another option that Ted Cruz, for instance, was pushing is that these companies get protection under Title 47, Chapter 5, Subchapter 2, Part 1, U.S. Code 230, protection for private blocking and screening of offensive material. Now, if you look under Section C, it gives you protection for Good Samaritan blocking and screening of offensive material. Subsection 2, Part A, any action voluntarily taken in good faith to restrict access to or availability of material that the provider or user considers to be obscene, lewd, lascivious, filthy, excessively violent, harassing, or otherwise objectionable, whether or not such material is constitutionally protected. Now, here it's essentially saying these companies are protected in the action they take if taken in good faith. Does anyone believe the censoring of Alex Jones was good faith? I think it's plainly clear it was politically motivated, which means their censoring is not covered by this. Their actions were clearly not in good faith, which means they don't deserve any of the protections of this U.S. code. This would open YouTube, Google, these companies, it would open them up to lawsuits for things like libel, slander, copyright. This alone would put an incredible amount of pressure on what were considered public forums and now considered publishers. This wouldn't necessarily make them freer. What it would do is force them to actually compete at a disadvantage with companies like BitChute, which do actually act as a public forum and do have this kind of protection. You could see lawsuits for copyright or libel cripple YouTube while BitChute stays untouched by them. This would actually give a one-up to these smaller guys who are being honest about being public forums without any increased government intervention that isn't already on the books. And then finally, beyond that even, there's always the put your money where your mouth is. Use these alternatives. Not just use these alternatives, use your platform, if you have one, to fundraise for them. Why don't these bigger creators who are worried about YouTube or Google being monopolistic, why don't you use your platform to fundraise for them? Hold a 24-hour stream and donate the super chats. You would actually be using big tech's platform to empower the alt tech. Could you imagine anything more glorious than that? I think all three of these options are good. We need to get rid of corporate welfare in general, but a good place to start seems to be with these companies that are behaving badly. We need to pull their protections, treat them as publishers, and open up to the same lawsuits any other publishers open to. And we need to act as responsible consumers. We need to fundraise for the sites we like, and we need to use the sites we like. We can't We can't act as slaves to these companies when there are alternatives out there. All of this can be achieved without handing a government-sponsored cartel to these companies, enshrining them forever on the internet, or at least for the next 100 years on the internet, without any chance for a competitor to beat them back.
So I think the answer to your question, and you and I have the same objective here, is less government intervention, not more.
We are the Republic's walls. Come and take it.